everybody in here. Look, today I got me a couple new rods, couple new reels. I'm gonna show you how to spool up your Baitcasters and your spinning reel. There's a little difference between the two, right? Obviously, I'm shopping for some fishing line here, but obviously spooling up a Baitcaster versus spooling up a spinning reel is a little different. And there's a couple little things you need to do. If you start off good, you finish good. So I'm gonna show you what you need to do with your fishing line when you're spooling up a brand new rod reel. Best way to do it so you don't have any accidents out there on the water.
All right, do a testing for me real quick.
Testing right here. This is what we're gonna do with fishing line in the shop with B-Lat. Coming in hot. Here we go, we got our line out. What I'm gonna show you, we're gonna go over how to spool up a spinning reel. We're gonna go up how to spool a Baitcaster correctly. So I think, in my opinion, spooling up a spinning reel is a little bit more difficult than a Baitcaster. So we're gonna start with the easy one, the one that's not quite as intimidating as the other one. Empty spool. One thing that you know that is really popular right now, obviously fluorocarbon line is a little bit more expensive than monofilament. So some people like to do what's called backspooling. And that's basically where you take some monofilament and fill up some of the spool so you're not using a full, 175 yards of fluorocarbons. That can get kind of expensive, right? So there's something that I've learned about backfilling a spool with monofilament. And for a long time, I didn't even use monofilament. I would just use whatever line that I can find. What I have found is if I do decide to backspool my Baitcaster so I don't have to use so much fluorocarbon, that's all you're doing is filling up the spool. What I've found, it is very important to actually use monofilament and not just use fluorocarbon or use some other type of line. Actually, before I use fluorocarbon for backspooling, some old, fluorocarbon, I would actually even suggest that you use braid. Here's why. When you use fluorocarbon is a harder material, and when it spools on your spool, it wants to back off. It wants to come off because it's a harder material, right? And if you use a fluorocarbon backing, it's going to cause a lot more backlash. It really does. It definitely causes a lot more backlash. And one thing that I realized is that I need to also go to a smaller pound test. I was using 15, 20, 25 pound test backing material because I didn't have to use quite as much backing, to fill up my spool. That was a mistake because the bigger the fluorocarbon is, the more bulky it is and the more springy it is and the more it wanted to come off my spool. So what I started doing was I started using 8-pound test mono for backing, or smaller pound test. You don't have to use exactly 8, but use smaller pound test mono. The reason being mono is a lot more easy to work with. It's more flexible, it's not as springy, it's just a lot softer material. And it's even softer and even more flexible the smaller the pound test. So 8 or 10 pound test backing, that's what I like to use for backing on my Baitcaster. So what was happening with that fluorocarbon, if I make a long cast and I get a backlash, the backlash was exaggerated and it was backlashing all the way down to my backing material. So what I did, I'll take my 8-pound test fluorocarbon, put a couple inches on there. You can fill up your spool just however you need be. If you're just going to be flipping to targets where you're not using a lot of line, obviously you can fill your spool up a lot more. If you're going to be making a lot of long casts, maybe you need to put not quite as much, just a little bit of mono backing on your Baitcaster. So you kind of got to judge it, and then you got to judge it by the what type of reel you got, how big the spool is. There's no one answer for how much backing material you need to use on your Baitcasters. That can be anywhere from 40 yards to maybe as much as 125 yards. It just depends on the reel, the application, and how big a pound test line you're going to be using. So for me personally, I don't really use a lot of backing material unless I'm using braid. If I'm just spooling straight up fluorocarbon, most of the time I'm just going to fill the whole spool up with fluorocarbon. I do that for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is, I backlash a lot, quite honestly. Like, people think professional anglers don't backlash. Well, look, this one right here backlashes quite a bit. So if I throw out there and get a big old nasty bird nest, I don't have to worry about putting that rod or reel down, because now I got a backlash. I had to cut it out, and now I don't have enough line on my reel. I like to just go ahead and spool the whole thing up with fluorocarbon. This is 20-pound test fluorocarbon. And what I'm going to do when I'm spooling up, you see, I didn't even thread my line through every guide on this rod. I just did it on the first one. You can do every guide if you want to, or you can do just one. I do suggest that you do just one, at least one guide works better than just going straight to the reel. And you're just going to thread your line right through the worm gear. Make sure your line doesn't go under the bar, under the little bar that holds your worm gear down. And I'm going to thread it under the spool, okay? I'll go under the spool, is what I like to do. You don't have to go under the spool. And I'm just going to make a little connection knot. My little connection knot is super easy. It's sort of like a little clinch knot is what I use. On some of these spools, like on my luge reel, I actually don't even have to, with fluorocarbon, I don't even have to tie a knot on the spool. They have little holes on the spool. What you can do is just stick your line through the hole on the spool and start reeling it up and your line will grab. It just depends on how you want to do it. To be safe, it's probably a good idea to tie you a little clinch knot and cinch that down on your spool. Make sure you cinch that down really good. One important thing to try to remember, always watch and make sure that there's no line that has went under any of the reel seats. It's real easy to kind of not be watching what you're doing and get it under the reel seat or around any of the equipment around the reel. So just reel that guy on there. Once you get it cinched down, take your scissors and cut your little excess off, and now you're ready to start spooling. Okay, you get that cut a little closer. I do like to cut it as close as possible, because if you get it close as possible, it just makes your spool start off a lot cleaner. And you don't have to worry about having any bumps in your spool or anything. All right, you get it started. There we go. Now, this is very important part of it. What I like about the Strike King lines, you see I've got a little suction cup here on the back of it. One of the hardest things to do when you're spooling line is to find somebody or some type of piece of equipment to hold your line while you're spooling up. You got a suction cup. This comes on the line when you buy it. And you can just stick that anywhere on your boat, any kind of flat surface, anywhere. I'm just going to take it and stick it to the, move this cooler here. I'm just going to take it and stick it right here to the fiberglass in my boat. And you want to make sure that that line is coming off of the top, because it's going to come off of your spool on your reel. When you go to make a cast, it's going to come off the top, just like toilet paper, right? So off of the top, make sure it's coming off of the spool that you're spooling from the top. It's going to go to your reel on the top. It keeps the coils consistent, and you're not working against the grain when you reel it up on your reel. Very simple. Make sure you guys see, like I was sitting here talking. Remember I was telling you how fluorocarbon wants to come off your reel? Just sitting there talking, it wanted to back off the reel. So make sure you start off with no backlashes, no bumps or anything when you start spooling up. It's going to pay off for you in the future. One thing you want to do when you're spooling your line on here, make sure you keep some tension as you're spooling it onto the reel. You see, I'm using the index finger and my thumb of my left hand, and I'm just placing it right here above the reel, and I'm going to reel that line up on my reel, keeping it nice and tight. Those first maybe 30 to 40 yards are very important. If you start good, you finish good. If you start bad and it's running to one side of your spool, or you got a couple, you didn't keep the line tight and it's starting to get a little bumps in it, it's going to end bad. So I'll just start it and just take your time, man. You know, sometimes when I'm in a tournament and I'm rigging tackle, you know, I might get over here and do like this, get it going pretty good. Take your time, keep some tension on there. As you get to the top of the spool, then you can kind of let off of that tension a little bit, okay? I'm just gonna reel it on, reel it on, reel it on. Here's a tip for you guys, especially when you're using bigger pound test fluorocarbon line, all right? Don't fill those spools up as high as you would normally. This is 20-pound test, bigger pound test. When I say bigger pound test fluorocarbon, I'm talking about 17, 20, 25. I like to keep my spool, I'd rather have less line than more line. Here's why. Remember I told you that line is especially brand new fluorocarbon. It's been on the spool a while. Who knows how long that's been on the spool since manufacturing. So it's in its original state. It's in that coil. It's been in a coil for 2 months, let's say, right? And you take it out of the pack, you go to make a cast, and it still wants to be in that nature that it was in a spool, but you're trying to straighten it all out. It's got some memory in it. What you want to do to keep you from having so many backlashes, to make that line more manageable, you're using friction of the spool. So I'll spool it a lot lower than I normally would, especially with big, I can't stress it enough, especially with big pound tests, 17, 20, 25 pound tests. Leave some gap in your spool. What that's going to do, when that line's exiting the reel, is going to give you a little extra friction. It keeps that line coil, the spool doesn't spin nearly as fast. So if you do get a little bit of an overrun, you've got the reel to help contain that line, slow the spool down, and you'll get a few less backlash. Doesn't mean that you're not going to get any backlash, but for sure it's going to help you with backlashes. I'll cut my excess. What we used to do back in the day, it doesn't work quite as good with fluorocarbon as it does with mono, but what you're going to do now, instead of when I go to thread the rest of the line through my reel, remember what we said, instead of opening the bill on my reel, just mashing the push button and letting that line go and feeding my line through the eyes, I'm going to do it a different way. That line, it wants to come off this reel really bad now, because now it's on a much smaller spool than it was when we just spooled it up. You see how big that spool is? We just went from this to that, to about a 2.5 inch spool. We went from probably a 6 inch spool to a 2.5 inch spool. It don't like that at first. So what I like to do, if you mash that button and you start threading it through the eyes, you're gonna notice that that line wants to come off there, and you get a backlash, and then you made a cast and you get a backlash. Here's the way to avoid that. Back off of your drag a lot, all right? Don't even mash the button. Just back off of your drag a bunch. And what you're gonna do as you're threading your line through the eyes, you're just gonna use your drag. And it's gonna keep you from backlashing, because you've got steady tension on your spool all along while you're threading your line. Keeps you from backlashing. Remember what I said, as long as we start off good, we're gonna finish good. And there's nothing more frustrating than putting on fresh fluorocarbon, taking it out, making your first cast, backlashing, and now you got a mess. We'll thread it through, and then you're ready. Look, I need a little extra. You see, I've got tension on my line because I didn't open my bill, I just used my drag. I can tie my bait on here. I'm gonna get this little Catchco swim bait right here and tie on my little swim bait, and I'm ready to go fishing. As simple as that. So that's a little bit on what you need to do with a Baitcaster when you're spooling that guy up. Spinning reels, all right, a lot of variables when you're talking about spinning reels. There's just a lot going on here. Line management is what kills you on a spinning reel. Spinning reels, it's funny. Spinning reels are considered probably, you know, you got a beginner fisherman, this is the first thing we give them. And in my opinion, I've had some of the most intense moments verbally with spinning reels ever. Like bait casting equipment, you either got a backlash or you don't. With spinning reels, it can get ugly really fast, okay? So I've got two setups that I use when you're talking about spinning reels. Sometimes I use straight up fluorocarbon or straight up mono. Most times it's gonna be fluorocarbon. Situation where I will use straight up fluorocarbon on a spinning reel is gonna be a situation where it's very windy, all right? Reaction baits, when I'm throwing a jerk bait, crank bait, you know, something probably with treble hooks, straight fluorocarbon, or if I'm in a situation where I know I'm gonna be breaking off a lot. Wade fishing, you know, I'm probably going to be breaking off a lot, because you throw out, you get hung, you can't just motor over with the trolling motor, you got to kind of figure out how to get over there. So sometimes I'm breaking off a lot, and just going straight fluorocarbon, it keeps me from having to tie 2 knots when I break off. I only got to tie 1 knot. Obviously that's going to be a lot faster, and I'm probably just going to be in a better mood the rest of the day. So I'll use it in that situation. For most, and be honest with you, for most applications, using braid to fluorocarbon is going to be the way to go. Increased sensitivity, longer casts, better hook sets, more flexibility with one rod and reel. Just the benefits of braid to fluorocarbon outweigh straight fluorocarbon 10 to 1. There's no question in that. But I do still think that straight fluorocarbon It has a place in my boat on my spinning reels. That's taboo right now because the fad is braided fluorocarbon. That's just what everybody likes to do. But there's certain situations where straight fluorocarbon works the best. What I'm going to show you how to do is how to spool this guy up with braid. We'll talk a little bit. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about my union knots and so forth. This is strictly about how to get started perfectly with your spinning reel with braid, okay? One thing you're going to need, there's two ways you can address this issue. When you're putting braid on a spinning reel, the spool doesn't spin. The line just exits the reel, okay? Now, unlike a baitcaster, the spool spins and the line exits as the spool spins off, right? That's the way the line exits the reel. The spool never spins here. It just simply coils off of the spool. The line does. The line's the only thing that moves during the cast of the spinning reel, which makes it easier to cast. You don't have to maintain the speed of the line to make a cast. But one thing you do have to do, especially with braid, you have to have something that the braid can bond to without slipping. If you just tie straight braid to the spool of a spinning reel, it's not going to work out good. It's going to slip on you. When you go to set the hook, that braid is going to spin on the spool because braid is slick and your spool is slick. There's no friction there, so the spool will just spin. So you'll go set the hook and your line is going to spin on the reel, and you're just not going to get any tension. You're not going to have any traction, but there's not enough friction there for the line to bind to the spool and not move. So to address that problem, there's two things we can do. The one that I prefer to do is I actually use electrical tape. Electrical tape, when you tie the line to the spool, the braid bites down into the electrical tape, it causes friction, and the line cannot spin on the spool when I put pressure. The other thing you can do is you can put a backing material onto the spool. Most of the time that's going to be some type of monofilament. You can do that as well, and then tie your union knot from your mono to your braid, or you can just put a little piece of tape at the end of the mono once you put however much you need on your spool. It does two things: keeps your braid from spinning, and also braid is a much finer diameter than fluorocarbon or mono. Very much smaller. I would say almost half. If you had 10-pound test fluorocarbon, 10-pound test braid, the diameter of the braid is going to be much smaller. So it's going to hold, you have the capacity to hold a lot more line on your spinning reel of braid than you do fluorocarbon or mono. So you can use that mono to take up some of that spool space, so you're not putting 300 yards of braided line on your reel. It'll take up some of that spool space, and you won't have to use all of your line. I'm using Strike King Pro Grade braid right here, 15-pound test. I like to use a high vis. Keep in mind, on my reel, this is a reel that I already use. I'm using just black electrical tape on the back of it. Doesn't matter what color it is. Doesn't even have to be electrical tape. You need something that this line is going to bond with so it doesn't slip. This is brand new out of the pack. And what I like to do, usually when I'm threading my line up, is I'm just gonna, this has the same suction cup, by the way. Just gonna put that there. What I like to do is just use the first eye. You can thread it all the way through the top. I just usually don't. You know, you can do that. There's no problem with that. What I like to do for my union knot to my spool, right? I'll just make pretty much just a clinch knot. I'll take and make a little bunny ear with my line like that, and I'll take the tag in, wrap it around my middle finger, and I'll just make about 3 or 4 loops back towards that bunny ear that I made. And then I'll run that tag in back through the bunny ear around my middle finger. And what I'll do is just leave a little bit of, I'll cinch that down until it's just about the same length as the spool. And then I'll put it around my spool and my spinning reel like that, and then cinch it right on down. Clip your tag in. You want to clip it kind of close because you don't want that tag in flopping around in your spool when you start spooling it down later. Okay. Click your bail over. And what I'll do is a couple wraps just to get this guy started. I'll get 2 or 3 wraps in. And then I'll lay my spool up here where I'm actually gonna spool my line up. Here's what you need to do. With braid, you can kind of get away with being careless about which way you lay your spool. But since I'm a professional fisherman, I just try to cover all my bases. So what you would want to do if you were spooling up any other type of line, fluorocarbon, mono especially, label up, lay it flat. It'll go right on the spool just the way it's coming on. All right? So I'll just lay it flat with the label up and spool it up like that. And you kind of have to go slow because every once in a while it'll, you know, the line will grab the spool like you see it there. And as I mentioned with braid, you really don't have to be, quite as intentional about which your spooling orientation. It's very limp, very soft material, which is one reason that I like to use braid to fluorocarbon combos. The braid is very manageable, very limp, long cast. The thing that I like about braid to fluorocarbon combos better than anything is it allows you to be flexible in your line sizes. 15-pound test braid is very, very hard to break. I can do a lot of things. I can do anything from saltwater fishing for redfish to catching smallmouth to catching crappie on 15-pound test braid. Now I can tell you why, because the 15-pound test braid is a pretty durable line. But if I need to go extremely finesse, I can put 6-pound tests on here. But if I need to take it to the coast and just absolutely rip on redfish, I put 15-pound tests on here with the same rod. So I may have 2 rods on the deck, but I have the capability of presenting my lures 6 or 7 different ways because I can change the pound test of my leader. That's one of the things that makes braid to fluorocarbon just why it's the way to go, because you can do so many different things with the braid to fluorocarbon combination. You can go from finesse to straight up bringing them in this god doggone boat power fishing with the same rod just by changing your pound test. I usually follow the same protocol. I don't like to fill my spool all the way up to the brim. I'm going to leave just a little bit of gap because you don't want that line getting a little coil in there and then it all backing off. All right, so leave a little bit of space in the lip of your spool to your braid. That's going to help you out. I'm about there, and just clip your line. I like to do the same thing that I do with my Baitcasters. Instead of, when I go to thread my line through the rest of my guides here, what I do, instead of opening the bail up and running the risk of opening it up and getting like a bad bird nest just to start off with, close the bail, all right, and then back your drag out a lot. That's going to give you just enough tension to where you don't have a mess on your reel, and you just take your line, feed it through all your guides, right? And every time you need a little extra, you just pull on it like that, and that's going to save you from making a mess most of the time. All right, and that, my friends, is how you spool up. You're new to bass fishing and you're wondering, like, how do I get any line on these reels? This is how you do it, my friend. It's one of those simple things that we sometimes take for granted. Making the right steps at the beginning will save you a lot of backlash, a lot of profanity if you're like me. All right, just keeping it real, folks. When you start having trouble with your line, rods, and reels, the language gets intense. Be real, you did it too. I know you have, because I fished with you. I seen your videos, I seen your Instagram, your IGTV, I seen your stories. You do it, you get a little intense. You start off good, you end good, everybody's happy, everybody wins. That's how you spool them up.